There are moments in life when you don't get to defend yourself, not really. You just sit there, holding the weight of someone else's assumptions, smiling because anything louder might cost you everything. And sometimes that smile is all you have left to protect your dignity. Jasmine Crockett knew that feeling. Not from headlines, not from talking points, but from years of walking into rooms where her voice was either talked over or used against her. And yet, she kept showing up. Because somewhere deep beneath the silence, beneath the interruption and the smirks, there was something she refused to surrender. Her story, and the night she sat across from Sean Hannity. That story, her story, didn't just push back. It exposed everything. What happened next silenced more than a studio. It cracked the room open. And what poured out was the truth. The air in the Fox News studio was colder than usual that night. The lights were perfectly angled, the set polished to a reflective shine, but something about the silence behind the cameras felt rehearsed, like a trap had already been set. Sean Hannity sat with one leg crossed over the other, skimming notes he barely intended to use. Across from him, a crisp stack of research materials lay unopened, untouched not because he didn't have time, but because he didn't think he needed them. "Is she here yet?" he asked a producer without looking up. "Just arrived," the young assistant replied. "They're walking her to makeup now." He nodded once, then added, "Let's keep this one tight. I want the border thing, then pivot into the voter misinformation case. I'll pin her to that." The producer hesitated. "You're referring to the Texas case involving youth organizers? The DOJ hasn't actually filed charges." "It's the narrative," Hannity said, finally looking up. "This isn't a courtroom. This is television. I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm trying to win the clip." There it was, the invisible push. Behind the glass walls of the control room, a few junior staff exchanged glances. They'd seen clips of Jasmine Crockett before on C-SPAN, Twitter, congressional hearings. She didn't shout. She didn't storm. She just stared, listened, waited, and then said something that felt like it had been rehearsed for a decade, even if it hadn't. A quiet kind of power. The kind that unnerves people who confuse confidence with volume. But Hannity wasn't worried. "She missed a press briefing 2 weeks ago," he muttered to himself. "Couldn't even show up for her own state caucus. She'll buckle." What he didn't mention was that Crockett missed that briefing because she was attending the funeral of a high school teacher from her district, someone who had taught her how to debate when she was 15. But that wasn't the kind of detail that made it into Hannity's playbook. He only saw what could be weaponized. As the cameras were being aligned and the lights finalized, Hannity glanced toward the entrance where guests typically entered. The moment he saw her silhouette approach, he leaned toward the mic and, with a smirk only half muted, said into his hot mic, "Glad you could make it this time, Congresswoman." It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them light, casual, drenched in performative politeness and unmistakable condescension, as if showing up on time was an achievement, as if every minute of his airtime was more valuable than hers. Crockett didn't flinch. She offered a brief nod, her smile the kind that didn't fully reach the ice knot out of coldness, but out of practice. She had worn that smile in courtrooms where she wasn't expected to win, in meetings where her name was mispronounced for the third time, in elevators where someone assumed she was staff not elected. She had been here before, not in this studio, but in this posture being evaluated before she spoke a single word. She took her seat opposite him, adjusted the mic clip to her blazer, and looked directly at him, not defiantly, but steadily, the kind of gaze that doesn't seek to dominate, just to witness. He didn't know it yet, but that would be the most dangerous thing about her. She saw too clearly. As the countdown began, 5, 4, 3, Crockett straightened her back but didn't tense. She didn't rehearse in the mirror before interviews. She rehearsed in memory of every time she'd been underestimated, every time someone called her young lady in a policy meeting, every time someone confused her with an intern while she was holding the brief that would decide a man's freedom. That was her preparation, not bullet points, experience. The red light blinked on. "Good evening and welcome to Hannity," the host began. Tonight, we're joined by Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett Fresh. Off a few headlines, I might add. Congresswoman, thanks for finally joining us. The emphasis on finally was soft, but it was there. She smiled again, this time fuller, but still calm. Thanks for having me, Sean. It's good to be here. It was a simple line, ordinary, but something about the way she said it measured, steady made the people behind the cameras sit a little straighter. Hannity leaned forward. Let's get right to it. There's a growing crisis in this country. Misinformation about voting rights is spreading like wildfire, particularly from left-leaning youth groups in your home state of Texas. And yet we see silence from your office. Why is that? Crockett didn't blink. She didn't reach for notes. Instead, she asked quietly, "Do you believe young people organizing to protect their vote is dangerous, Sean?" It was a soft, curveball no accusations, just a question. But it disrupted the flow. Hannity frowned slightly. Dangerous? No. Misinformed? Yes. And when people mislead others about how and where to vote, that's not democracy. That's interference. There it was again. Not a direct attack. A shaping of perception. A gentle reframing calling confusion. Interference. Painting concern as a threat. Crockett tilted her head, listening, not rushing. And in that moment, the real stage was set, not the one with lights and logos, but the emotional arena the audience couldn't yet see. What Sean Hannity had just delivered wasn't a knockout punch. It was the first invisible push. And what he didn't realize, what most of America didn't yet know, was that Jasmine Crockett had spent her entire life bracing for moments just like this. But this time, she wasn't going to lean back. She was going to push back. Quietly. Precisely. And in a way that wouldn't draw blood, but leave a scar. There's a certain kind of silence that comes after a question, like the one Jasmine Crockett just asked. Not loud, not dramatic, just still. Hannity was the one speaking, yet somehow it felt like Crockett was steering the entire moment, and she hadn't raised her voice once. In the control room, a junior producer whispered to no one in particular, "She's not reacting." But that was the point. Crockett knew what he was trying to do. She had seen the pattern 100 times before. Paint a complex issue with a single brushstroke. Turn confusion into criminality. Suggest that if young voters made mistakes, it was a sign of malicious intent, not a reflection of a system that was never built for them in the first place. She smiled again. This one smaller, softer. It was the smile she learned to wear as a young attorney standing in front of mostly white juries, defending black teenagers who were always presumed guilty before the first word was spoken. It was the smile she wore in court when a judge asked if she was shadowing the real attorney, the same smile she gave donors who called her feisty like it was a compliment. Behind that smile was not politeness. It was restraint. Hannity leaned in again. "Congresswoman, we're talking about facts. We've seen cases, multiple cases, where activist groups provided misleading information about voting deadlines, ID requirements, registration status. Doesn't that concern you?" Crockett folded her hands slowly. "It concerns me when misinformation spreads, Sean. But it also concerns me when we ignore who created the confusion in the first place." He chuckled, low and practiced. "So you're blaming the system?" "I'm describing it," she replied. And then, for the briefest moment, she went quiet. Not because she lost her train of thought, but because the memory had crept in uninvited but vivid. It was 4 years ago, a rainy Tuesday, Harris County Courthouse. She was defending a 19-year-old black girl named Tasha Green, who had been charged with voter fraud. The girl had received a mailer from a local group encouraging her to register early. She had followed every instruction, filled out the form, signed where it said to sign, submitted it through her community center. The problem? The form was a photocopy. The signature page was slightly misaligned, and by the time the county clerk noticed, the deadline had passed. Her registration was denied. But when she showed up to vote, any believing she had registered, she was arrested. Crockett remembered how Tasha sat beside her, eyes wide, trying to figure out how she went from community volunteer to criminal defendant in a week. They lost the case. The DA offered a deferred judgment. No jail time, but it meant Tasha had to plead guilty to attempted election interference, a felony in Texas. Tasha took the deal. She had to. She couldn't afford a record. She wanted to be a teacher. After the hearing, as the courtroom emptied and the bailiff started turning off lights, Tasha handed Crockett a note folded 3 times. It said, "Thank you. You were the first person who looked at me like I wasn't a mistake." Crockett still carried that note, not in her purse, but in memory where it weighed more. Back in the studio, the lights felt warmer now, the tension rising, but still unspoken. Hannity pushed again. "Let me be clear, Congresswoman. You're saying these youth organizers are victims?" "I'm saying," Crockett replied, "that we've created a process so complicated that ordinary citizens, especially young voters, poor voters, first-time voters, need a legal team just to feel safe participating. And then we act shocked when they mess up." The studio quieted. Even the camera operators, long trained to focus without emotion, exchanged glances. Hannity tried to pivot. "Then how do you explain the coordinated effort to remove voter ID laws?" Crockett didn't look away. "You ever met someone who doesn't have an ID, Sean?" He blinked. "Of course. Ever tried to get one without a car, or a credit card, or a birth certificate you can actually find? You ever stood in line at the DMV with a mother who just got off a night shift and has 30 minutes before her next job?" He didn't answer. She continued, voice calm, steady. "In 2017, I represented a man named Henry Jones, Vietnam veteran, 68 years old, lived in Fort Worth his whole life, voted in every election since 1972. But his driver's license expired. He didn't drive anymore. He brought 2 utility bills and a copy of his military ID. Still got turned away. Why? Because the address on the ID didn't match his electric bill. That's not voter security, Sean. That's bureaucracy, pretending to be justice." Somewhere off stage, a floor manager checked her headset, forgetting for a second that she was supposed to be cueing the next graphic. Crockett hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't touched the glass of water in front of her. She just sat there still, precise, undeniable. And with every word, she made something uncomfortable very clear. This wasn't about statistics. This was about stories. And her smile? That was the armor. Because the truth she carried couldn't come out raw, not here, not on Fox. It had to be filtered, measured, delivered with surgical calm. If she showed too much emotion, she'd be called unstable. If she showed too little, she'd be called cold. So she smiled. But the weight behind it, that was centuries deep. By the time the commercial break ended, Sean Hannity's tone had shifted. It was subtle at first, a longer pause between questions, a slightly more pronounced smirk, a tapping finger on his desk that wasn't there before. For a man who prided himself on control, these were cracks in the veneer. His playbook wasn't landing. His rhythm was off. And Jasmine Crockett? She was still composed, unmoved, still smiling. But not kindly. As the cameras returned to live broadcast, Hannity leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice slightly louder. "Congresswoman, you've made some interesting points about bureaucracy and voter access," he began carefully. "But I want to go back to something you tweeted last year where you suggested we abolish voter ID requirements entirely. That's a pretty radical position, don't you think?" Crockett took a second, not because she needed time to answer, but because silence, when used well, is a scalpel. Then she answered, "I tweeted that after meeting a grandmother in Houston, Sean. Her name was Mrs. Dolores Shepard. She marched in Selma, watched her brother get beat by Alabama state troopers in '65. And last year, she was turned away from voting 3 times because her state ID expired 6 weeks prior." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at the camera. She just said it plainly, like an undeniable fact. 3 times, she repeated. 3 times she stood in line. 3 times she was told, "Sorry, ma'am, not good enough." But she had her utility bill, her Medicare card, her photo. She even brought her Bible. She'd always brought it when voting. Said it reminded her why it mattered. A hush fell over the studio note, dramatic, not performative, but quiet in a way that said, no one expected that story. And so, yes, Crockett continued, I did say we should abolish voter ID requirements. Because if a woman who risked her life for this country's progress can't vote over an expiration date, then the issue isn't security, it's spite. Hannity exhaled, nostrils flaring. I think you're ignoring the very real threat of voter fraud. No, Crockett interjected, still calm, still precise. I'm saying that in our obsession with preventing fraud that almost never happens, we've created obstacles for the very people democracy was supposed to protect. She could have said more. She could have pulled up DOJ statistics, pointed out that voter fraud rates in the U.S. hover around 0.00003%. But she didn't need to. She wasn't there to win a spreadsheet war. She was there to tell the truth and let the room decide what to do with it. Hannity straightened his tie, visibly annoyed. The control room scrambled to change graphics. Voter ID debate now flashed behind him, a default fallback. But even the Chiron couldn't reset the balance of power. So he pivoted. Let's talk about leadership, Hannity said, a smile creeping in. Congresswoman, you've been in office for what, less than 2 years? And yet here you are speaking like an expert on systems, on institutions, on law. Isn't that a little presumptuous? There it was. The dig. The who do you think you are? Line dressed up in polite skepticism. Crockett didn't flinch. Sean, I spent years defending people who couldn't afford attorneys. Years arguing in courtrooms where my presence was questioned before my credentials. And every day I showed up, I watched how systems operate not on paper, but in practice. She leaned in, gently. So, when I talk about voter suppression, I'm not guessing. I'm recalling names, courtrooms, transcripts. I know what it looks like when the system smiles at some and snarls at others. The audience in the studio wasn't clapping, but they weren't moving either. No coughs, no whispers, just eyes locked forward. It was the stillness before a shift. And Hannity could feel it. He interrupted, grasping for ground. With all due respect, Congresswoman, the American people don't want lectures. They want solutions. What's your actual plan? Let anyone vote without ID? Let 16-year-olds register online? Just open the floodgates? Crockett paused again, then said softly, do you know how many states allow 16-year-olds to pre-register already? Hannity opened his mouth, then stopped. 14 states and the District of Columbia, she answered. It's already happening, and not one of them has reported a spike in fraud. Her tone was matter of fact, like a teacher tired of correcting the same homework mistake. And Sean, if we really cared about secure elections, we'd invest in accessible civic education, consistent ID standards, mobile registration units. But we don't, because this isn't about security. It's about shaping who shows up. That line didn't go unnoticed. Producers in the booth started marking timestamps. Hannity tried again. So what, you're accusing Republicans of targeting voters? Crockett looked at him directly this time. I'm saying that any law passed in the name of integrity that disproportionately disenfranchises black, brown, or poor voters isn't integrity. It's strategy. A producer in the back whispered, oh, that's going to trend. Hannity, clearly frustrated, reached for his last reliable move, escalation. You're dancing around the real issue here. The left wants chaos. No voter ID, no accountability, no consequences. You represent the radical wing of a party that's abandoned working Americans in favor of progressive theater. This was supposed to be the knockout line, the moment where she'd get rattled, defensive, emotional. But instead, Crockett smiled. Not the tired smile, not the practiced smile, but something different. She tilted her head slightly, looked directly at Hannity, and said, you know what's radical, Sean? He raised his eyebrows, waiting. It's radical to use your platform every night to tell working Americans that their problems come from immigrants or protesters or the left, instead of the corporations outsourcing their jobs, the politicians gutting their health care, or the billionaires funding laws that keep wages low. She let the silence breathe. And what's even more radical, she added, is pretending that defending democracy is somehow too much. That was it. The shift, you could feel it. A studio designed to spotlight confrontation was now watching something else, a recalibration. Hannity reached for his notes, realized he hadn't written anything that could counter that, and went silent. Crockett didn't capitalize. She didn't gloat. She just folded her hands, waited, and said, "You asked about solutions. That's mine. Tell the truth, even when it's messy, even when it costs votes." No camera cut. No graphics flew in. Just a still shot of two people and one of them no longer in control. The studio was quieter than it had been all night. Even Hannity noticed. Usually, by this point in a segment, he had either scored his headline moment or outmaneuvered his guest enough to pivot. That's how these things worked. Control, camera, closure, but not tonight. Jasmine Crockett sat across from him, perfectly upright, her posture unthreatening but undeniable. She wasn't leaning forward. She wasn't angling her shoulders like a debater. She simply occupied the space like she belonged there, and somehow made it feel like she always had. And Hannity? He was stalling. He glanced off camera, where his producer gave the stretch signal. They needed more time, or maybe just more control. He adjusted his tie again, this time tighter than before. "Well," he said, feigning calm, "since we're on the subject of truth, Congresswoman, let's talk about your party's role in spreading false narratives. Last month, your caucus circulated a memo saying that voter ID laws were the new Jim Crow. You really stand by that comparison?" He leaned back, arms crossed, waiting. A trap, clearly. And Crockett saw it. But traps only work when the target doesn't know they're walking into one. She nodded slowly. "I do." Hannity tilted his head. "Really?" "Yes, I stand by it. Because intent isn't the only measure of oppression, Sean. Impact is." He shifted in his seat, suddenly unsure if he wanted the follow-up. Crockett continued, "My grandfather, Curtis Morgan, was denied the right to vote twice. Once in '58 because he didn't pass a literacy test, and again in '62 because he couldn't name all 95 counties in Texas from memory. That wasn't a law that said black people can't vote. It was a law that pretended everyone had the same access to knowledge, time, and power." She paused. "Sound familiar?" Hannity opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett cut in not with force, but with precision. "You know what the most dangerous kind of suppression is? The kind that hides behind paperwork, behind neutral procedures. The kind that says, 'It's not our fault you couldn't meet the deadline.'" She leaned forward slightly, just enough to mark the shift. "That's how it works now, Sean. We don't use fire hoses or billy clubs anymore. We use expired licenses, arbitrary signature matches. We use lines so long in black neighborhoods they wrap around the block twice, while suburban polling places have donuts and heaters." The control room froze. The sound technician turned down the music bed under the segment. They didn't need it anymore. Crockett continued, "We've made voting harder for the very communities who have the most at stake, and then we ask them why they don't trust the system." Hannity tried to speak. "But voter ID is—" She didn't raise her voice. "Sean, stop, just for a second." He blinked, and she asked softly, "Do you know what it feels like to bring your grandmother to vote and have to explain to her why they won't let her in? Why the same country that asked her to serve, to sacrifice, to obey, now tells her she's a threat to its integrity because she forgot to renew a card?" Hannity didn't answer. Because he couldn't. Not truthfully. "I do," she said, "because that happened. To me, to her. And when I said it felt like Jim Crow with a spreadsheet, I meant it. That line, that image, It would live far longer than the segment itself. Jim Crow with a spreadsheet. In the studio, a camera operator shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in awe. Hannity inhaled deeply, his hands folded tightly on the desk now. So, let me get this straight. You're saying the entire system is racist? I'm saying systems don't need to scream slurs to be unjust, she said. They just have to stay quiet when injustice becomes routine. Another silence. Another blow. And yet, she still hadn't raised her voice. That was the blade. And now it cut deeper. You're a lawyer, Hannity finally said, trying to pivot. You know that comparing these laws to Jim Crow is inflammatory. You're a public official. Don't you worry that using that kind of language alienates people who might otherwise agree with you? This was supposed to be the reset, the reasonable concern, a way to frame her as divisive. Crockett looked down, took a slow breath, and then said, being polite has never freed anyone. And then the final turn, the one no one expected. I came on this show tonight because I believed we could have a conversation, not a performance. But what I've gotten is interruption, selective framing, and a host more interested in optics than honesty. Hannity sat upright. I take issue with. She didn't let him finish. No, you don't get to take issue with me when you invited me here just to make a point not to hear mine. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened. You've called me radical, inexperienced, divisive. You've interrupted me at least a dozen times. And when I finally get to speak, you question the words I use to describe my own community's lived experience. He tried again. You've had plenty of time to. I've had just enough time to be dissected, not to be understood. Now the audience could feel it. The temperature had dropped. Not because she'd grown cold, but because the heat of spectacle had given way to the chill of truth. You invited me here to debate voter access, Crockett said. But what you really wanted was to paint a picture of chaos, of fear, of a system under attack. And then you wanted to hang that picture around my neck. She leaned back, relaxed. But I'm not your canvas, Sean. Hannity looked directly at her. And she said the sentence that would live on every screen, in every clip, on every social thread for weeks to come. If this conversation made you uncomfortable, imagine what it feels like to live it. The studio fell into total silence. In the control room, a junior editor whispered, "There's your moment." And it was. The line wasn't shouted. It wasn't theatrical. But it was undeniable. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a reckoning. Hannity sat there, eyes wide, trying to assemble a response. But words so often his weapon had failed him. And in that pause, Jasmine Crockett did something even more powerful than winning. She waited. Waited as the silence told the story better than any retort could. The red light above the camera dimmed. The segment had ended, technically, but no one moved. Sean Hannity remained seated, staring down at his cue cards, as if they'd suddenly started speaking a language he didn't understand. His usual post-segment ritual, the head nod, the witty toss to commercial, the confident smirk never came. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett simply uncrossed her hands. She didn't gloat, didn't exhale like she'd won something. She just sat back in her chair like someone who had simply told the truth and had been waiting years to do so. A producer's voice came through the earpiece, "We're clear." Still, Hannity didn't speak. It was the sound tech, an older man named Rick, who'd worked there for 17 years, who broke the quiet. "She didn't raise her voice once," he said aloud. "Not once." In the control room, the atmosphere had shifted from coordination to disbelief. No one said it, but they all knew. Something had just happened, and not the usual viral soundbite or media firestorm. This wasn't just internet content. It was something heavier, quieter, lasting. By the time Crockett walked off set, her phone had already buzzed 3 times. Texts, mentions, notifications. Then 10. Then 40. And that was just the beginning. Within minutes, the clip of her final line, If this conversation made you uncomfortable, imagine what it feels like to live it, had been ripped, captioned, and reposted by media accounts on both sides of the political spectrum. Some used it to cheer, others used it to mock. But none could ignore it. That line had hit a nerve, not because it was angry, but because it was accurate. And people don't forget accuracy when it hurts. By midnight, the video had crossed 500 views on X. By morning, it had passed 7 million. By the end of the week, the New York Times, CNN, and even BBC World News were dissecting it line by line. A political science professor from Stanford called it a textbook example of rhetorical asymmetry. A media analyst at Columbia said, "She didn't win by arguing harder. She won by refusing to play by the rules of provocation." Even Anderson Cooper opened his segment the next evening with a raised eyebrow and a line that would become a meme. Well, that was different. But perhaps the most surprising reaction came from within Fox itself. According to leaked internal memos, the network held 2 emergency meetings following the broadcast. One producer reportedly said, "That wasn't a loss. That was a collapse." Another added, "She dismantled him without breaking a sweat." Hannity, to his credit, appeared on air the following night but offered no reference to what had happened. Instead, he opened the show with a story on gas prices and then pivoted to international affairs. But the audience noticed. And silence, in moments like these, becomes its own confession. Within days, other news outlets began comparing the encounter to pivotal media moments where guests turned the tables on hosts, not with volume, but with something more disarming, clarity. Clips of the interview were being used in debate classes, communication workshops, and even theology courses, where Crockett's calm under pressure was cited as an example of nonviolent rhetorical resistance. But perhaps the most unexpected consequence wasn't the media attention. It was the emails. Thousands. Young people, first-time voters, senior citizens, veterans, teachers, parents, people who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett until that moment. People who thought she was too radical and now wondered why. And in the middle of that flood came a name she hadn't heard in years. Tasha Green, the young woman Crockett had defended and lost in a voter fraud case years ago, the one who had written her that folded note saying, "You were the first person who looked at me like I wasn't a mistake." Now she was 23, teaching English at a high school in San Antonio. Her email was short. Subject, "You spoke for us." Body, "I watched what you did on that show. And all I could think was, they finally heard you. And through you they finally heard me too." Crockett read the message 3 times, then closed her laptop. She didn't cry, but her hands rested on the desk longer than usual, just still. Like she was holding something fragile, not the message, but the moment. Because what Tasha had written was true. For once, they hadn't edited out the silence. They hadn't cut her off mid-sentence. They hadn't spun her words into talking points. They had watched. They had listened. And they couldn't unhear it now. A week later, Sean Hannity began changing the format of his show. Subtly. No announcement. Just less interruption. More space. His next Democratic guest spoke for nearly 90 seconds, uninterrupted, a small eternity in cable news. A whisper of change. Was it a reaction? Was it strategy? No one knew. But people noticed. And so did Crockett. She didn't post about it, didn't celebrate. She simply kept doing what she'd always done, showing up with the truth and waiting for the room to catch up. Back in D.C., during a closed-door session with young staffers, someone asked her, "How did you stay so calm?" Crockett thought for a moment, then said, "Because the truth doesn't need to yell." The room fell silent, not out of awe, but out of recognition. They weren't used to hearing that. But now, they wouldn't forget it. That single sentence, "If this conversation made you uncomfortable, imagine what it feels like to live it," was now etched into the architecture of political storytelling. It wasn't a mic drop. It was a mirror. And the power of a mirror is It doesn't need to speak. It just shows you who you are. And if you can't handle the image, the problem isn't the reflection. It's the reality. Sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that doesn't try to be louder, just clearer. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't storm off. She didn't play to the cameras. She simply told the truth. And in doing so, she made a room built for noise fall completely still. And now I want to ask you, have you ever been in that position? Where you knew you were right, but had to carry it with grace? Where speaking up meant walking a tightrope between being heard and being dismissed? Where silence wasn't weakness, but survival? If that's you or someone you know, let this story be a reminder. You don't have to shout to make history. You just have to stand your ground, hold your truth, and refuse to shrink for someone else's comfort. Because every time we choose dignity over ego, every time we stay calm when the world expects us to break, we plant something deeper than a point. We plant a legacy. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, or maybe even yourself, share it with them. Share it with your sister, your mentor, your student, your mother. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. Not just for the stories, but for the strength behind them. Drop a comment below. Tell us, when was your Jasmine Crockett moment? And remember, if this conversation made you uncomfortable, imagine what it feels like to live it. I'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.